Imagine you're on your porch at midnight, radio murmuring ball games into the warm dark, when a stranger pauses at the end of the driveway and tilts their head like they heard their name. That's the mood tonight. For more than a century, we've been leaking chatter into the sky songs. Sitcoms, radar pings, a soap bubble of human noise growing at the speed of light. And then, out of the black, an interstellar visitor shows up with a trajectory that looks like intention. Not a mothership blotting out the moon, just a quiet messenger with excellent timing. This isn't a jump scare story. It's a what if, whispered over coffee, you shouldn't be drinking this late. What if our long, accidental hello finally hit someone's antenna? What if 3I Atlas, the third confirmed interstellar object to wander through our solar system, wasn't wandering at all, but nudged, aimed, or at least curious because of us? We're going to keep it friendly, keep it simple, and keep the math behind the curtain, unless it helps. Think campfire chat, not chalkboard exam. We'll separate the facts from the fireworks. We'll explain the few terms we need as we go. We'll laugh at our own cosmic ego when it deserves it, and still leave room for goosebumps. Because maybe the universe didn't send a memo. Maybe it just tapped the glass and waited to see if we'd tap back. Settle in. Dim the lights. If you start to drift off, that's fine. This is a documentary for curiosity, not insomnia. But if you stay, the question gets better. Did we really call, and did something actually answer? Before we fly off into speculation, let's walk calmly through the part everyone forgets. We've been a noisy neighbor for a very long time. Not on purpose at first. When you push a radio signal hard enough to reach a city, you also, unavoidably, leak a little into space. That spill becomes a shell. Imagine a soap bubble expanding outward at light speed, filled with our baseball announcers, weather reports, and late-night reruns. Astronomers call that shell our radio bubble. If you drew it to scale, it's now about 100+ light years across, a faint sphere of human chatter bathing a few thousand nearby stars. It's not a megaphone. It's more like a party you can hear only if you live on the same block. And even then, you have to press your ear to the fence. When people hear broadcast to the stars, they picture big dramatic moves, the grand speech, the ceremonial ping at the heavens. We did try some of those. The 1970s were a heady time. Plaques bolted to Pioneer 10 and 11 with a simple star map and a line drawing of two humans. A gold record aboard each Voyager stocked with greetings, whale song, and Chuck Berry for rhythm, and a 3-minute radio postcard fired from a giant dish in Puerto Rico toward a star cluster because, frankly, it felt good to say hello. The idea wasn't, they'll get this next Tuesday. The idea was symbolic. A lighthouse turned on for the principle of it. Or as Carl Sagan liked to remind people, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is another way of saying, start with humility, end with patience. If you've never met the hydrogen line, it's worth a proper introduction. Hydrogen is the simplest and most abundant element, and its atom can emit radio light at a very specific pitch, around 1.42 gigahertz, when its electron flips orientation. Think of it as the universe's tuning fork. There's a quiet patch of the radio spectrum around that pitch, nicknamed the water hole because it sits between the natural emissions of hydrogen and the hydroxyl radical, ingredients of water. If you were trying to set up a cosmic chat room, you'd go where the background is quiet and the signposts are obvious. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has pointed antennas at that patch for decades, not because we're romantic, but because it's sensible engineering. Here's the unfun part. Physics is a buzzkill. Signals fade with distance by the inverse square law, which just means that if you double the distance, you quarter the strength. Shine a flashlight across a field and you can see the beam. Shine it across the Pacific, and it might as well be a shrug. Most of our TV and FM transmissions smear into the cosmic background within a handful of light years. The rare exceptions are the big boys, planetary radar blasts we use to map asteroids or Venus, and the deep space dish networks that whisper to our probes at the outskirts of the solar system. Those can be bright enough to catch with a comparable antenna from another star, and to any engineer watching our patch of sky, they'd look peculiar, narrow, structured, and repeating with Earth's rotation, like a lighthouse sweeping a harbor. We do try to keep the universe's library quiet enough to read. International bodies reserve certain frequencies for radio astronomy. There's even a radio quiet zone in the hills of West Virginia where cell service goes to die so telescopes can hear the cosmos breathe. It's a reminder that listening is work and quiet is precious. We're searching for technosignatures, as Jill Tarter has framed it, not little green men, not saucers, just measurable fingerprints of technology in places where nature would be unlikely to produce them. Of course, if you listen long enough, you will hear something weird. In 1967, a young researcher, Jocelyn Bell Burnell, noticed a radio pulse so regular you could have set watches to it, one ping every 1.337 seconds. For a nervous moment, the team labeled it LGM-1 for little green men. It turned out to be the first pulsar, a rapidly spinning neutron star sweeping a radio beam past Earth with lighthouse precision. That was a humbling lesson. Nature has a bigger imagination than we do. 10 years later, a telescope in Ohio printed out a strong, tidy signal near the hydrogen line, and an astronomer scribbled "Wow" in the margin. 72 seconds of intrigue that never repeated. The "wow" signal lives in the gray zone between fascinating and probably nothing we can prove, which is where most flirtations with the unknown like to camp. If you're thinking there must be rules for what to do when you think you've found the cosmic equivalent of a text message, there are. The community leans on protocols. Verify with independent telescopes. Rule out earthly interference. Don't call a press conference because your spectrum analyzer coughed. Publish your data so others can check your work. There's even a Rio scale to score how whoa a detection is. A kind of Richter scale for potential contact, which keeps the temperature down when someone hears a beeping fridge and writes aliens in all caps. Inside the field, there's a long, friendly argument that occasionally stops being friendly. Traditional SETI is the patient introvert, ears open, mouth shut. Then there's METI, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, the extroverts who say, look, if everyone just listens, no one ever hears anything. They want to transmit on purpose now, using big antennas and neat math, the way you'd knock on a door if you're sure you've found a house. The counter-argument is ancient and parental. Don't shout your address into a dark forest. Who appointed us to speak for Earth? What if we're loud before we're wise? The debate isn't just philosophy, it's policy. High-power transmitters touch export controls. International agencies care which frequencies you use. And the public has a vote, at least morally, in whether we should put a return address on our cosmic postcards. It helps to keep two truths in your pocket at once. First, we are probably not the only clever chemistry experiment in the Milky Way. There are hundreds of billions of stars and more planets than anyone knows what to do with. Second, the distances are absurd and evidence is hard. That tension-abundant real estate, stingy receipts, is why the field lives on both skepticism and optimism. Sagan's other razor applies nicely. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You don't assume a city is abandoned because your flashlight can't reach it. If you could look at Earth from 50 light years away with ears as good as our best dishes, here's how we'd sound. The spectrum would be messy, but patterned, like looking at a barcode through a shower curtain. Radio and TV carriers would wink in and out as the planet spins. A few times a day, a razor-thin beam from a planetary radar would blaze across your sky, scream bright for minutes, then vanish. The deep space network, those huge balls in California, Spain, And Australia would murmur at deep space probes with stable tones only an engineer would love. It wouldn't feel like thunder. It would feel like machinery. Every once in a while, we do something flamboyant on purpose. The Arecibo message in 1974 was only 3 minutes long, 1,679 bits, because 1,679 is the product of 2 primes. A little mathematical wink that says, arrange me as 23 by 73, and a picture pops out. If anyone ever decodes it, they'll see a low-race math and biology postcard. Numbers, DNAs, double helix, a stick figure, a sketch of the solar system, Earth highlighted like a kid pointing to their house on a map. Was it practical? Not even slightly. The target is 25,000 light years away. Was it symbolic? Completely. You light a candle not because the sun will notice, but because you want to be the kind of species that lights candles. These gestures are charming, but the everyday reality is less romantic and more forensic. SETI is a data game. You sift petabytes of radio noise for anomalies, and then try to kill those anomalies with better hypotheses. You knock out satellites, microwave ovens, and weird reflections off passing aircraft. You watch the candidate field thin until a handful of stubborn blips remain, and then you ask your grumpy friend on another continent to point their telescope and see if they can catch the same ghost. When nothing repeats, you sigh, save your code, and keep going. The sky is generous with mysteries, an astronomer once told a graduating class, and stingy with answers. They meant it kindly. Culture doesn't wait for peer review. Whenever someone whispers, "We heard something," pop culture kicks the saloon doors open. We've been rehearsing First Contact since Orson Welles convinced a few people on the radio that New Jersey was under attack. Movies taught us to expect discs over cities and instant translations. Real life is more likely to look like spreadsheets, slow pings, and very patient arguments about error bars. If there's a reply to be had, it won't be a thunderclap. It'll be the gentlest tap on the window you can detect. All of this brings us to the uncomfortable question that sits in the middle of tonight's story, like an unblinking cat. Given the bubble we've blown, how far has our noise actually traveled? And could anyone within that reach have reasonably heard us? The answer is both modest and thrilling. The bubble's radius is only as big as the years we've been noisy. 100-odd light years isn't much by galactic standards, but there are plenty of stars inside that sphere, some sun-like, some with known planets, all bathed in the faint whisper of our existence. Our loudest shouts, the radar pings, are narrower, like throat clears that sweep across the sky as Earth turns. If a civilization with ears like ours happened to sit where one of those beams washed past, they'd get an unmistakable whiff of technology. Now turn the telescope around. If you were them, and if you'd picked up those peculiar, structured hints years ago, what would you do? You could log the anomaly and move on. You could aim a better antenna at the source and wait for the pattern to repeat. Or you could put a messenger on a trajectory that intercepts the source star's planetary plane, time its arrival for when the locals' telescopes will notice, and let the physics of curiosity do the rest. That third option is the seed of tonight's what if. Not an invasion, not even a handshake. More like placing a book where the librarians can't miss it. Before we get too dreamy, it's worth admitting how many guardrails keep everyone honest. Governments that fund big dishes and planetary radars are aware of public nerves. Agencies talk to one another. There are committees at the United Nations with names that sound like tranquilizers, peaceful uses of outer space, planetary protection that exist precisely to slow impulsive behavior. None of this stops human nature, which is to speculate early and often. But it does keep the official tone measured, even when the group chat is buzzing at midnight. There's one last practical bit that matters if our porch light analogy is going to hold up. When you think about being heard, power is only half the story. The other half is pattern. Nature can be loud. Quasars and masers blast radio light with gusto. What makes technology stand out isn't volume. It's the fingerprints, unnaturally narrow frequencies, exquisitely stable oscillators, tidy modulation, and motions that track a moving craft rather than a star's clockwork. That's why the hydrogen line is catnip. It's a place where a narrow, deliberate tone sticks out like a violin in a forest. If you ever wanted to send a message that says, "We know you know where to look," that neighborhood in the spectrum is where you'd hang your lantern. So we arrive at the doorstep of the question that keeps people awake long after the telescope has gone to bed. We've been shouting and whispering, on purpose and by accident, for generations. Our bubble has washed over a lot of real estate. If anyone out there played the same engineering game, we do scan the waterhole, flag anything that looks like a machine, correlate it with a small blue planet's rotation, and they could, in principle, notice us. And if they noticed, they might try the polite thing first. Don't crowd the porch, just pass by close enough that the homeowner sees you, and maybe hum a tune. You know, they know. That, finally, is why 3i ATLA makes people fidget in their seats. It's not because it's dramatic. It's because it's mundane in exactly the ways an engineer would choose. Small, fast, unthreatening, but timed and tuned to be impossible for a curious species to ignore. If the universe were trying to say message received, it wouldn't need fireworks. A wink would do. If you want to understand why an object with a clunky name could keep astronomers up past midnight, you have to rewind to the moment the solar system got its first uninvited out-of-town guest. In late 2017, a faint speck zipped through the inner system on a path that didn't curve back toward the sun like a proper comet. It didn't even bother to loop. It came in, tipped its hat, and left on what's called a hyperbolic trajectory translation. Too fast to be captured by our gravity. Speed and path shaped like an open curve, not a closed ellipse. The discoverers named it 1i Aumuamua Hawaiian for Scout, which is honestly the perfect vibe. We measured its light brightening and fading as it tumbled and found something elongated, like a cosmic cigar, or, if you prefer more appetizing metaphors, a pancake flipped aggressively by an inattentive chef. The weirdest part wasn't the shape. It was the tiny extra acceleration that didn't fit neatly into gravity alone. Comets can get a little rocket push from warm ice, venting like spray from a shaken soda bottle, but telescopes didn't see the usual dusty tail. Cue the arguments. One camp said, hidden outgassing, case closed. Another said, unusually reflective stuff pushed by sunlight. A bolder voice suggested, maybe a light sail. To which the consensus replied with the scientific equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Show more work. 2 years later, a second visitor cruised through that everyone could agree was a proper comet. 2i Borisov sported a textbook head and tail, chemistry that looked reassuringly familiar, and no attitude problem with the laws of motion. If the first guest was a riddle in a trench coat, the second was your friendly neighbor returning a borrowed cup of sugar. Together, they taught us two things at once. Interstellar objects aren't mythical, and some will behave, so normally you'll yawn while others will make you set fresh coffee and redouble your math. So when a survey telescope spots a fast mover with the paperwork of a traveler from beyond speed too high, path too open, you now have a recipe for a genuine freakout. Not the aliens, quick, where's my towel? Kind, the this is rare, point everything at it kind. Modern surveys like Atlas are built to find things that change asteroids, flares, anything that blinks or shifts against the wallpaper of stars. They take rapid images, subtract yesterday from today, and let the software raise its hand when a dot moves wrong. Then the minor planet center, the librarians of the sky, gathers sightings from all over the world and publishes an orbit so everyone else can aim their instruments. It's glorified cross-checking, and it works. What's interstellar in plain terms? Imagine the sun's gravity as a giant bowl. Anything born here usually rolls around the rim in an ellipse, sometimes a long, skinny one, but it stays in the bowl. An interstellar object is a marble thrown so hard it zips through the bowl and keeps going, leaving a trail we can measure. The tell is that open, hyperbolic curve. You don't need calculus for that. You just need to notice it isn't coming back for seconds. Now imagine you're the team on duty when the new spec shows up. You start simple. Brightness versus time to infer shape and spin. A quick spectrum to see if the sunlight reflecting off it looks reddish like organics, gray like rock, or something stranger. You ping it with planetary radar if geometry allows, bouncing radio off the surface to judge texture, like shouting in a canyon to hear if the echo sounds smooth or rough. If it's venting gas, you'll see the fingerprints of water or carbon monoxide in the spectrum. If it's quiet, you get a cleaner mirror of the sun's light and more questions. The moment that flips astonishment into goosebumps is when the radios notice something riding along with the object that nature doesn't usually hum. A narrow, stable tone near the famous hydrogen line at 1.42 gigahertz. Let's unpack why that's a jaw-dropper without getting sweaty with jargon. Natural radio sources, pulsars, nebulae, even masers, are broad or messy. They shout in bands. Technology favors tidy, needle-thin frequencies because that's how you squeeze information efficiently. It's the difference between listening to a waterfall and finding a flute. If the tone also drifts in frequency, exactly the way it should as the object races toward and then away from us. The way a passing siren changes pitch, you start crossing off boring explanations. Measure twice, talk once. As radio astronomers like to mutter at 3 meter, it's hard to overstate how cautious the community gets at this point. Interference from Earth is everywhere. Satellites, aircraft, even microwave ovens have fooled big dishes. You don't announce anything until another telescope, preferably on another continent, points at the same moving dot and hears the same tone with the same Doppler drift. Only then do you say the quiet part out loud. Whatever that is, it seems to be singing with the traveler. You'll notice I'm not using the A word, not because it's forbidden, but because good science crawls toward it backwards, dragging a wagon full of alternative hypotheses. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself. Richard Feynman warned, and you are the easiest person to fool. Public reaction, meanwhile, moves at the speed of rumor. The instant an observing log leaks or an amateur with a software-defined radio posts a waterfall plot on social media, everyone's cousin becomes an expert in hydrogen spin-flip transitions. Newsrooms want a headline that fits on a smartphone screen. Engineers want more time on the dish. Politicians want briefings. And the rest of us want to know whether to feel awe, dread, or that peculiar fizzy mixture the Germans should frankly have a word for by now. Here's where our central, slightly cheeky premise strolls back in. Hands in pockets. Could such a visitor, let's say 3i Atlas, for the sake of tonight's story, have anything to do with the noise we've been leaking for a century? The timing matters. Our loudest blasts, the planetary radars, began in the 1960s and grew teeth in the 70s and 80s. Our TV and radio carriers made a bubble much earlier, though pretty faint. If you sit within, say, 50 light years in the right patch of sky, you could have sampled a rotating, structured, distinctly artificial spectrum sweeping past day after day. You might not know our language, but you'd recognize engineering. Nature rarely makes a line that narrow. As one spectral analyst told me with the delighted dread of someone spotting a paw print where there shouldn't be a cat, if you picked us out of the background and wanted to be noticed without spooking the horses, you wouldn't send a dreadnought. You'd send a messenger that astronomy cannot ignore, but cannot fear. Make it modest in size, hundreds of meters, not miles, so no one mistakes it for a moon. Give it a path that slices the inner system at an angle our surveys will catch. Add behavior that's testable, a controlled spin that keeps a face sunward like a solar panel would, a surface that sometimes reflects like a mirror, and sometimes drinks light like Mac paint. A radio tone perched just off the hydrogen line, where even graduate students know to look. You nudge it so its closest approach happens when the big dishes can track it for hours without Earth itself getting in the way. That's not an invasion. That's a calendar appointment. The hard part, and the part that keeps the grown-ups talking slowly into microphones, is separating engineered from exotic but natural. Some carbon-rich materials are absurdly good at soaking up light and re-emitting heat. Some ices can vent in directional puffs that mimic tiny course corrections. The more unusual an explanation sounds, the more you check whether a perfectly pedestrian rock could be doing a very good impression of a gadget in your head. Extraordinary claims, Sagan again, require extraordinary evidence. The flip side is that extraordinary evidence doesn't always arrive with a trumpet. Sometimes it's a whisper you can only hear because you did all the boring homework first. Assuming our messenger really is humming, the next chess move is obvious and terrifying in equal measure. Do we hum back? There are playbooks. You start with math, the lingua franca of anyone who counts. You repeat primes, mirror their rhythm, maybe reference the hydrogen atom itself, the same little flip that defines 1.42 gigahertz as a way of saying, yes, we're tuned to the same universal clock. You don't send your favorite poems or your Wi-Fi password. You send robust, redundant patterns a clever species could decode with a pencil. And you watch like hawks to see if anything changes in response brightness, spin rate, the tone itself blinking in a way that can't be coincidence. If all of that sounds like an elaborate courting ritual, that's because it is. Think less, take me to your leader. More, is this a good time to talk? We're not the first generation to imagine this dance, but we are the first with the instruments to hear a soft knock on the cosmic door and the etiquette to answer without shouting. And if 3i Atlas is exactly that, a polite knock timed for the moment our ears are good enough, then the right response is equal parts wonder and discipline. So yes, it's absurd to imagine we summoned anything. We didn't cast a spell. We left the porch light on, loudly, for a century. If someone out there noticed the glow and decided to stroll by, that says less about mysticism and more about shared engineering instincts. We made ourselves noticeable. They made themselves noticeable back. Somewhere between those two decisions is the kind of story a species can tell itself and sleep, not because it has all the answers, but because the questions finally feel like they're pointed in the right direction. If you want to know whether we could have called anything here, first picture our civilization as a campfire at night. The flames are the obvious stuffed giant transmissions we meant to send. The smoke is everything else we didn't plan on, drifting where the wind takes it. Space doesn't have wind, but it does have a rule that punishes slackers. The farther a signal travels, the fainter it gets. That's the inverse square law in street clothes. Double the distance, quarter the strength. It's why your favorite station turns to hiss when you leave town, and why most of our casual chatter fades into the Milky Way's background after just a few light years. A light year, by the way, is simply how far light travels in a year about 10 trillion kilometers. Astronomy's way of admitting the tape measure is too short. There are, however, moments when we swap the campfire for a lighthouse. Radar aimed at planets and asteroids is obscenely bright in radio terms. A narrow, deliberate beam that could be picked up from very far away by ears as good as ours. Think of a hairdryer versus a laser pointer. One is loud up close and useless at range. The other cuts through the fog. If you were out there with a proper dish, you'd notice us. One radio engineer told me with the grin of someone who has definitely pointed 1,000,000 watts at Venus on a weeknight. We've also been accidentally tidy about which part of the dial we light up. Engineers have an almost religious fondness for the hydrogen line at 1.42 gigahertz. Hydrogen is everywhere. Its electron flips its spin and emits a photon at that frequency. That flip is a perfect cosmic mile marker, a tone any species with a basic lab can find. There's even a nickname for the quiet gap around it, bounded by hydrogen and the hydroxyl radical, the water hole. It's not poetic to think a meeting might happen near water. It's just extremely practical. Fewer natural shouts means artificial whispers stand out. Still, detectability isn't just about wattage. It's about pattern. Natural sources tend to smear their energy across a range of frequencies. Technology likes tidy carriers, a needle of power at a very exact pitch. If you've ever watched a waterfall plot, that's a spectrogram that scrolls with time. You can see the difference at a glance. Nature paints fat bands. Technology draws crisp lines. A narrow line is the world's politest knock. A SETI veteran likes to say, "We didn't invent that logic. Physics did." But even if someone noticed our lighthouse flashes and our accidental leaks, could they have answered with a visitor in time for us to see it now? That's the rub people get stuck on, and it's where the imagination instantly jumps to warp drives and cinematic shortcuts. There's a calmer way to think about it. You don't need an armada tomorrow to say hello today. You can seed messengers on long, economical arcs that only need to be smart at the end. You can launch many, knowing most will be ignored, the way dandelions launch absurd numbers of seeds. And you can choose trajectories that graze the inner solar system when surveys are most likely to catch them, which, conveniently, is now. Our telescopes are finally good at this game. It's not crazy to imagine someone designed their knock to arrive once the doorbell actually worked. The geometry matters too. Our radio bubble has grown to roughly 100+ light years in radius, a sphere of faint human fingerprints expanding through the neighborhood. That's not a uniform glow. Earth spins, transmitters turn on and off, and our brightest beacons only point in one direction at a time. From the right patch of sky, a curious neighbor would see a rotating bundle of narrow lines and occasional megawatt pings, sweeping past like a lighthouse beam every 24 hours. You wouldn't decode our sitcoms from that, but you'd know a planet was doing something repetitive and electrical. That's enough to mark the map. If you were designing a reply, you'd pick the opposite of drama. No looming craft blotting out the moon. No sudden detours that make orbital dynamicists spill coffee. You'd make something that respects the traffic rules of the inner system and announces itself in ways astronomers can confirm. A controlled spin so the brightness rises and falls like a metronome. Surfaces that sometimes act like mirrors so radar gets clean specular echoes, then turn matte so thermal cameras see honest heating and cooling. A radio tone placed just off the hydrogen line so it doesn't hide under nature's voice, drifting in frequency, exactly as a co-moving source should, courtesy of the Doppler effect, that change in pitch you hear when an ambulance flies by. Except this one's a whisper across tens of millions of kilometers. Notice what's not in that plan. Words. Nobody leads with poetry in a channel this fragile. You start with math because math is what survives bad weather. Primes, ratios, simple constants. You let the receiving side prove they can catch a ball before you throw a curve. If they answer, if their tone blinks in the same rhythm you just sent, or their brightness nudges in sync with your test, you've got your handshake. Don't trade novels before you've exchanged alphabets. As one information theorist deadpanned after too little sleep and too much coffee. This is also where the very human reflex to either hype or dismiss gets in our way. A tone near the water hole isn't automatically engineered. Plasma can be mischievous, and instruments have been embarrassed before by leaky cables and snack room microwaves. On the other hand, insisting it must be natural until geology personally apologizes isn't as scientific as it sounds. Real skepticism is symmetrical. You try to break both stories, the gadget story and the weird rock story. You ask, if it's natural, why is the line that narrow and that stable? If it's engineered, why is the power modest and the behavior so cautious? And you keep asking until one answer is left standing after all the boring, meticulous work has had its say. If the modest Cautious answer wins. Something beautiful happens next. This stops being about fear, invasion, or any of the pulp tropes we've practiced for a century. It turns into etiquette. We've been a noisy neighbor without meaning to be. This could be the universe, leaving us a note under the door. We hear you. If you want to talk, here's where to knock. That's not summoning. That's mutual discoverability. We got loud enough to notice. Someone else got careful enough to be noticed back. And underneath the wonder is a lesson that frankly makes engineers glow. This isn't magic. It's systems design at interstellar scale. Find the quiet band. Use stable references. Respect the receiver's constraints. Be redundant. Be obvious. Be patient. If that sounds like the world's nerdiest dating advice, you're not wrong. The cosmos is suddenly less a horror movie and more a very slow, very considerate text thread. There's one more ingredient in this stew that almost always gets overlooked: timing with our culture. We're at a moment where the tools to catch such a thing are finally in the hands of many, not few. Software-defined radios are cheap. Public archives exist. Backyard dishes and university arrays can compare notes in real time. Even if agencies wanted to, they couldn't jam the genie back in the bottle. That democratization is a feature, not a bug. If a visitor wanted their knock to be heard, they'd aim for an era when the hearing is shared. That's now. So, did we summon Three-Eye Atilas? No capes, no incantations. We did something much more mundane and much more profound. We built a planet-sized, hey, we're here, over a century of experiments, broadcasts, and radar chores, and then we improved our ears until a polite knock stood out from the hum. If that knock is truly there, and will keep being ornery about proving it, then the next step isn't to panic. It's to answer with the same mix of humility and competence that got us this far. Whisper back. Show you can count. See if the porch light blinks in reply. The night it answered didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like someone quietly lifting a finger and saying, I'm here. Around sunset in Chile and boredom o'clock in half the world, a robotic telescope designed to catch wayward space rocks flagged a perfectly impolite point of light where no such point should be. If you've never met this kind of robot, imagine a vigilant night guard who never blinks. Every 30 seconds it snaps the sky, then plays spot the difference with math. Stars sit still, interlopers cheat. This one cheated. Astronomers speak a language that sounds like poetry until you realize it's just geometry with a cold nose. Motion against the background stars. Brightness that refuses to be boring. A path that, when you run the numbers, doesn't loop the sun but dives in and slings out, like a tourist who will not be staying for the weekend. That doesn't loop part is a clue called a hyperbolic orbit. If an orbit were a roller coaster, this track doesn't circle the castle. It roars through the park and keeps going into town. That's what interstellar looks like in equations eccentricity greater than one, though we can skip the algebra and keep the picture. In from the dark, back to the dark. Follow-ups piled up the way follow-ups do when a bat signal goes out. Different telescopes, different continents, same verdict. Real object, fast, unbound. Someone at a control room whispered, "Not from here." And the room got very quiet in the way rooms do when everyone starts thinking about dinner and destiny at the same time. Then came the hum. Not a guitar hum. A needle-fine tone at a radio pitch that has a cosmic name tag. The hydrogen line. That's 1.42 gigahertz. The frequency a hydrogen atom naturally emits when its electron flips its tiny magnetic alignment. Engineers love it. SETI folks practically frame it. The idea is simple. If you want your whisper to stand out, you whisper where the universe is usually quiet. The tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It did the two things that separate a maybe from a please look again. It narrowed to a razor's width, and it drifted exactly the way it should if it were riding with the object. That gentle slide in pitch is the Doppler effect, like a siren dropping in tone as it speeds away. Except this siren is a sliver of radio light crossing tens of millions of kilometers. Nature rarely draws lines that clean, a radio astronomer muttered to me later, and I could hear both delight and dread in her voice. Delight, because clean lines are candy. Dread, because clean lines get headlines, and no one wants to be the person who mistook a microwave oven for Mars again. Yes, that happened once. Somewhere out there, a cafeteria appliance is still a legend. None of this means blinking lights and soaring soundtracks. What it means is that for the first time in a long time, a lot of very sober people began trying to break two stories at once. If it's a natural comet or asteroid, why is the radio tone so stable and so neatly parked near hydrogen's favorite pitch? If it's engineered, why is it so polite, so faint, so careful, so relentlessly confirmable? Extraordinary claims need ordinary discipline, said a senior observer who has seen more false alarms than most of us have seen dawns. That discipline looks like independent telescopes verifying the same signal, different receivers with different cables agreeing on timing and drift, and an entire catalog of boring checks that scientists secretly love because they protect us from ourselves. Meanwhile, the object did a second, softer magic trick. Its brightness rose and fell with uncanny regularity, as if it turned a face toward and then away from the sun on a schedule. That pattern has a name-like curve, and buried inside it are clues about shape and spin. A lumpy rock tumbles and gives you a messy rhythm. This rhythm was tidy. Think a metronome with personality. Sometimes radar dishes shot at a ping, the radio equivalent of a bat squeak, and the echoes came back eerily nearer, like what the pros call specular. Rough things scatter, smooth things shine. Suddenly, the maybe a shard picture felt too simple, and the something thin with surfaces picture started to make more sense. You don't need to jump to sailboats from other suns to follow that thread. A solar panel is also a thin surface. So is a slab of ice. So is, well, you see the trap. More than one thing fits the clues? Then the space-based eyes weighed in. Infrared cameras, basically heat cameras in orbit, watch the object warm in sunlight and cool in shade. But the cooling didn't behave like a passive rock. It plateaued, as if some part of the surface could throttle how fast it shed heat. Engineers call that thermal control. Nature does it to fresh snow versus black asphalt. But the details here made modelers rub their temples. Either the material is weird, or it's doing something on purpose, said one thermal scientist, before adding the correct, responsible caveat. And the universe has a long track record of making us regret the word weird. The hum, though that tone near hydrogen kept, returning to center stage. At first, it was just there, a steady note. Then, like a shy drummer tapping the rim, faint structure crept into the rhythm. Gaps spaced like prime numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7. Not at TED Talk volume, not with fanfare. Just enough that multiple teams, running different algorithms, began seeing the same count. The best part? When one group pre-registered their analysis a promise about what tests they'd run before they peaked, the pattern held. That's the scientific version of not moving the goalposts when your cousin brings the ball. If you're waiting for a decoder ring, you'll be disappointed. Early signals like this are less "we come in peace" and more "do you have a dial tone?" Math is the universal icebreaker because it's hard to miss here. Primes are especially good because nature doesn't make many perfectly spaced, indivisible beats by accident. Even so, the teams kept their champagne corked. Plasma can hiss, and hiss in tricky ways. Instrumental ghosts can fake patterns if you stack the data wrong. The most useful voices in the room were the ones saying things like, "Let's try to kill it 3 more ways." Out in the world, restraint did not trend. The moment word leaked that multiple facilities were seeing something near the waterhole, the nickname for the quiet, radio band bracketed by hydrogen and the hydroxyl radical, the internet did what it does. It's replying. It's a psyop. Sat next to a thread about building backyard dishes from salad bowls and hope. You can't unring a hydrogen bell. Amateur radio folks tuned in with software-defined radios, the size of a deck of cards. Some heard nothing but hiss. Some swore they heard the tone and posted screenshots like proud parents. The beauty and the headache of our era is that confirmation is no longer centralized. That makes hoaxes harder and messy nights inevitable. Inside the observatories, a different kind of mess brewed. If you're going to answer, who answers? National networks can transmit. University dishes can too, if you feed them enough wattage. There are protocols for this, gently worded documents about verification and international coordination. But protocols are like umbrellas. Excellent until the wind sideways. Reply slowly and say nothing you haven't already shouted for decades, advised a veteran of the early SETI days. The safe opening gambit is arithmetic you can draw on a napkin. The unsafe gambit is your home address and your Wi-Fi password. Even without a reply, the objects seem to acknowledge attention. During one long stare from a giant dish, its brightness hiccuped for exactly as long as the facility transmitted a calibration tone. That could be coincidence. It could be thermal stress. It could be the world's politest wink. This is the maddening edge we walk. Enough strangeness to keep us awake, enough ambiguity to send us back to the chalkboard. And hovering over all of it is the question that brought us here. Did we summon anything? Or did we just become audible to the right ears at the right time? The more you look at the timeline, the less mystical it gets. Our accidental radio bubble has been expanding for a century. Our deliberate lighthouses, the big radars, have been sweeping the sky for half of that. Our surveys only recently got good enough to catch fast movers efficiently. If a careful, conservative civilization wanted to check on the noisy neighbors without startling the horses, this is exactly the kind of knock you'd expect. A slim visitor on a safe track, a tidy spin that photometry can love, a tone where scientists actually listen, and a patience that borders on parental. Maybe that's the real plot twist. Not that something came, but that it chose understatement. No roaring engines. No speeches. Just the sort of message a good engineer sends when they want to be heard by people who live in a universe that does not owe them clarity. Simple, robust, kind to the channel. If we did summon it, we did so the way a lighthouse summons a ship by existing, and by being hard to miss if you happen to be passing through the fog with your eyes open. If you want to know whether the knock was for us, and not just a random rap on the cosmic doorframe, you do what nosy neighbors do. Check the security footage. In astronomy, that means rewinding a century of our own noise and asking where and when it would have spilled into space loudly enough to catch an eavesdropper's ear. The picture that emerges isn't mystical. It's logistics. Start with the bubble we've been inflating since Marconi turned the ether into a playground. Every broadcast leaks, and everything that leaks travels at light speed, which is both fast and painfully slow. Picture a growing sphere centered on Earth, about 130 light years in radius now, full of old jingles, baseball play-by-play, lunar radar pings, and the occasional physics lecture. Most of it fades into cosmic hush within a few light years. Signals obey the inverse square law the way raindrops obey gravity. Double the distance, quarter the power. The only shouts that carry are the ones we designed as floodlights, planetary radars, those million-watt lighthouses we aimed at Venus and passing rocks. If anyone noticed us, odds are it was on a radar night, as one engineer at Goldstone likes to say, half proud, half guilty. Now run the tape backward from our visitor's arrival. If it came from, say, 50 light years away, it couldn't have known we were noisy until 50 years after we started being noisy. That delay is the universe's cruel customer service hold music. Add whatever time it needed to travel here, which depends on how spry you think the builders are. 10% of light speed? 5. It sounds like science fiction until you realize that thin structures pushed by light, the sail family of ideas, let you trade mass for patience. Fast is hard, a propulsion specialist told me, but persistent is surprisingly doable. Of course, it's not enough to wave vaguely at a compass and say, "Over there." Astronomers pulled star catalogs, grabbed the places in the sky our strongest transmissions were pointed when they were fired, and drew invisible cones. You don't need math tattoos to follow the trick. Aim a bright radar at Venus, and your beam spills past Venus into deep space. On different dates, that spill points toward different patches of sky. Those patches are where any patient listeners would have seen Earth briefly become the brightest thing in its neighborhood. One team overlaid those patches with the directions our interstellar visitor seems to have come from, allowing for the way stars drift over decades like lazy swimmers. The overlap was suggestive, not proof, the lead author kept repeating, but not flattering to chance either. This is where statistics sneaks in wearing thick glasses. If you comb enough maps for coincidences, you'll find a face in the toast. Scientists try to keep themselves honest with things like pre-registration, which is just a fancy way of promising what you'll test before you go hunting. Another favorite is the Monte Carlo simulation, which is an even fancier way to say, shuffle the deck 1,000,000 times and see how often luck alone deals you the same hand. When those shuffles still return a low roll of the dice for coincidence, people start clearing their throats. If I saw this in particle physics, I'd raise an eyebrow, a statistician said dryly, and I have miserly eyebrows. Meanwhile, the radio data had its own breadcrumbs. Remember that ceremonial message we blasted at a star cluster in the 70s because we were feeling poetic? That one used a clever trick. You send 1,679 bits because 1,679 is the product of two prime numbers, 23 and 73. Anyone with a brain and time to kill will try arranging your bits into 23 by 73 or 73 by 23, and da to your stick figure and D and a ladder pop out. Decades later, our uninvited guest began tapping primes in a way that echoed the spirit, if not the letter, of that old stunt. There were enough deviations to keep the grown-ups honest. The way a good teacher changes a number in the homework, so you can't copy the answer key. It wasn't parroting, said a SETI veteran, tapping the table in tidy groups of 2, 3, 5. It was showing it knew why primes are cute. Skeptics, bless them, refused to be charmed. Pattern finding is the one superpower humans don't need to power with caffeine. Give us snow on a windshield and we'll swear we see a face. Plasma can whistle in narrow bands. Receivers can develop personalities. Cables can throw tantrums. If you stare at enough waterfalls, one will look like words. A radio astronomer who has debunked more miracles than most of us have owned cell phones, put it cleanly. The job is to kill your darlings and see which ones keep moving. So the community played whack-a-mole with explanations. Could the neat tone near the hydrogen line, the universal hailing frequency, at 1.42 gigahertz be an artifact of our own satellites? Observatories on different continents, with different front-end electronics and different local interference, saw the same thing. Could the light curve rhythm be an illusion of sampling? Teams using different cadences recovered the same period. Could the heat plateau be a modeling trap? A rival group plugged in different material properties and got similar stubborn behavior. Each survival made the quiet in the control rooms feel heavier. The scariest idea wasn't aliens. It was targeted. The trajectories of this object, and a few smaller companions, when traced backward through the sun's gravity zoo, hinted that they weren't just plucked randomly from the galaxy's grab bag. They arrived from a loose cone in the sky, as if some faraway patch had tossed several darts toward the inner solar system over a spread of months. Randomness has a look. This had a theme. If that's natural, one dynamicist sighed, It's a very organized kind of natural. At this point, you can feel the script writing itself, and that's exactly when the professionals get itchy. We've leapt before. There was a time when a precisely ticking radio source made otherwise sober people write LGM in the margin for little green men. It became a pulsar, which is gloriously natural and gloriously weird. There was another time when a once-only squeal near hydrogen made an astronomer write wow in the margin. It became an enduring mystery, not a memo from the neighbors. The universe rewards patience and punishes certainty. But patience doesn't preclude curiosity. Testing whether a signal is about you is hilariously old-fashioned. You say something basic and see if the other party says it back with flair. That doesn't mean blurting personal details into the void. It means mathematics and units and a little humility. The safe icebreaker is to count together. If they count along, you step up to multiplication. If they play with your numbers, you're in a conversation. Think of it like knocking a rhythm on a wall, a communications expert told me, and listening for knuckles that aren't yours. There's an emotional undertow to all this that the data plots won't show. The idea that our visitor is a reply to a century of our leakage tickles something ancient. It makes us feel seen. That is a dangerous fuel. It can power good science, and it can power cults. The best room I sat in while working on this story had both the skeptics and the romantics in it, and they were each other's seatbelts. The skeptics kept the romantics from drifting into storybook space. The romantics kept the skeptics from turning wonder into paperwork. Behind the scenes, one quiet consensus did form. If we answer at all, we answer slowly, publicly, and with math a school kid could check. No coordinates. No, we are so clever. Let us teach you about prime factors. Just the courteous basics at the same pitch the visitor seems to like, with the same Doppler compensation to keep the beat steady, and with enough redundancy that a clumsy species like ours can't embarrass itself by dropping bits. And we log everything in triplicate, because history loves receipts. None of this proves we summoned anything. In a way, the more you accept that we've been a lighthouse for a while, the more ordinary this starts to feel. Ordinary in the sense that tides are ordinary, and sunsets are ordinary. They happen for reasons we can write down, and they still make us stare. We've been loud. We've been visible. Our sky surveys finally got good at catching quick visitors. If someone out there is careful and patient, this is exactly how they would say hello, with a geometry that leaves room for doubt and a signal that leaves room for math. Maybe the lesson is less about cosmic destiny and more about manners. We didn't summon. We signaled. They didn't invade. They RSVP'd. And somewhere in that exchange, between our sloppy century of chatter and their tidy, prime-tapped nod is the beginning of something that looks a lot like a conversation, provided we remember how to listen without hearing only ourselves. If you've ever tried to talk across a windy street, you know the trick. Keep it simple, pick a rhythm, and don't overthink the vowels. Space is the wind here. The plan that took shape was basically a cosmic version of tapping on a radiator, except the radiator is 45 million kilometers away and humming, along near the frequency hydrogen atoms naturally whisper at. That pitch around 1.42 gigahertz is where the universe is quiet enough to hear a pin drop, which is why radio astronomers call it their happy place. The awkward part wasn't the physics. It was the people. Who gets to say hello on behalf of 8 billion roommates? Over a week of hurried calls and coffee, the color of motor oil, the usual alphabet soup tried to grow a spine. The UN office that usually worries about satellite debris suddenly found itself debating manners with the International Telecommunication Union, whose job is to keep radio channels from stepping on each other's toes. We've protected that band for listening, one veteran said, rubbing his temples, not for duets. Meanwhile, the scientists were drawing up a message so dry you could light a campfire with it. Numbers first, units second. A nod to hydrogen, because we're polite like that. It felt like writing the world's nerdiest postcard. What made it urgent is the clock no one could slow. Our visitor was on a hyperbolic past-think slingshot, not orbits, so the geometry that made it easy to hear today would make it impossible to reach by next season. Windows in radio are like windows in houses. They close on squeaky hinges. Pointing a transmitter at a fast-moving target means compensating for the Doppler shift, which is the way a siren slides in pitch as it rushes past you. Except now the siren is our carrier tone, and the moving ambulance is, well, a mystery panel from the stars. A young engineer summarized the task with exactly the right amount of fatalism. We aim where it will be, sing where it will be listening, and hope we're on key. The content was almost aggressively modest. A sequence of primes, long enough to be unmistakable, but not so long we look like we're showing off. A clean definition of the second, using hydrogen's spin-flip transition, which is a mouthful that boils down to this. Hydrogen's electron can sit aligned or anti-aligned with the proton's tiny magnet. The flip between those states is a universal metronome. From there, a gentle nudge toward the simplest map you can draw without giving anyone directions to your front door. Relative positions of the sun and the big planets by their orbital periods, expressed in that same hydrogen-based unit, so any listener could tell we know how to count and how to keep time. The first send felt almost domestic in its ordinariness. In the control room, the air had that electric hush you get just before the orchestra lifts bows. On a big screen, a thin line of power crept up at the chosen frequency, then flattened into a steady plateau. Somewhere out in the black, photons that started in a dish on Earth began their long, 8-minute sprint to a speck we could not see with our eyes. If there's an echo, a senior astronomer murmured, it will be the best 8-minute elevator ride of my life. And then the line changed. Not dramatically. No fireworks. Just a new heartbeat under the carrier, spaced in a way a mathematician's ear would call tidy. 2, 3, 5, 7. The pattern we'd sent came back with the twist clusters interleaved, as if someone were not merely mirroring us, but riffing. Imagine knocking 1, 2, 3, and getting back 1-2-3-1-3-5. Not random, not hostile, playful in the tiny sense that prime numbers allow. It's the difference between a parrot and a pianist, someone whispered, and nobody told them to stop being poetic. There was a second surprise, which took a few hours to confirm, because everyone was allergic to being fooled. The object brightened just enough to be seen in photometry, the careful business of measuring how much light a thing gives off right when our transmission arrived. Not a flare like a match, more like a shutter, briefly wider. You could rationalize it as heating. Sunlight plus dark stuff equals glow. But the timing lined up suspiciously well, and when you've spent weeks scolding yourself about wishful thinking, suspicious timing starts to look like choreography. It nodded, a grad student said, grinning and terrified, as if she just waved at a bear, and the bear waved back. The temptation at that point was to sprint. Humans are champions at turning first contact into first conclusions. The better impulse was to slow down and repeat ourselves. Science is repetition with receipts. Another transmission went out, same polite numeracy, with a tiny change that would make any mirror obvious. The return incorporated the change, and then did something rude to our nap schedules. It stepped beyond counting and sketched the bones of motion relationships that look like the way orbits behave when gravity does its curving space thing. No words, obviously, just ratios and periods, and the kind of symmetry that makes physicists tap pencils. It was as if a hand on the other side of a paper was tracing circles for our benefit, and we were tracing along, clumsy but willing. None of this answered the loudest quiet question. Did we trigger this? Or did we just happen to be around when the universe felt chatty? The only honest answer is the one pilots use when clouds get weird. Trust your instruments and fly the plane. What the instruments say is that our part of the galaxy has been lit by our own emissions for a century. that the strongest of those were bright enough to stand out, and that a smart, patient someone could have used them the way hikers use a lighthouse to find the shore. What they also say is that we are excellent at seeing patterns that aren't there. So the right way to proceed is to keep making moves that are useful either way. If it's natural, we'll learn new plasma physics and thermal tricks. If it's intentional, we'll practice being the kind of species that can listen as well as speak. The politics didn't vanish just because the cosmos winked. Security folks wanted to veto anything more complex than counting. Philosophers wanted to add a stanza about ethics. A chorus of lawyers suddenly discovered an appetite for interstellar case law. One space agency director, equal parts weary and wry, put it like this: imagine the first telephone call in history and 14 ministries arguing over what to say. Now imagine the telephone is also a telescope. The switchboard is on 3 continents, and the neighbor might be a genius. That's Tuesday. So the compromise held. No secrets, no stunts, no coordinates, nothing you wouldn't be happy to find on the front page. Every packet and time tag went into a public archive within hours, with the raw bits available for any grad student, amateur, or retired ham operator to poke. It turned out to be a brilliant guardrail. A dozen independent groups, using code they wrote themselves, recovered the same structures. One high school team in Arizona posted a thread that caught a subtle modulation our grown-up filters had ignored, and the next night Send adjusted to test it. The Cosmos didn't grade our homework, but it did draw a faint line under the right answer. If you're hoping for drama trumpets, declarations, cutaways to world leaders clearing throats sorry to disappoint, the texture of this kind of moment is a blend of tedium and goosebumps. Most of the time you're checking calibration tones and yawning into lukewarm tea, and then a line on a spectrum wiggles exactly when and how it shouldn't if the universe were indifferent. And for a few heartbeats, your chest remembers. You are a mammal who once stared at fires and told stories about lights that moved. Did we summon anything? Personally, I like the Homer verb. We called. It called back. Maybe it heard the whole chorus of our century radars, sitcoms, wedding speeches carried skyward, and decided to tap on the window with a math knuckle, because that's the only knuckle 2 strangers can trust at first. Maybe it's a natural phenomenon that just happens to wear a very convincing necktie. Either way, the next steps look similar. Keep the rhythm, raise the complexity only when both sides seem to follow, and treat the night like a classroom where everyone is bright, no one is fluent, and chalk is precious. We didn't light a beacon and summon a ship. We looked up from our noisy campfire and found, just past the trees, another flicker. If that's all it is, it's more than enough. And if it's more, we'll need to be the kind of storytellers who can translate wonder into patience. The news didn't land as a shout. It seeped. It leaked across breakfast tables and bus stops, and the light glow of phones in dark bedrooms. A few hours after the second exchange, the mood on Earth felt like the 5 minutes after an eclipse, when everyone is smiling and confused and a little unmoored. Call centers saw at first more people than usual asking for a stranger to just stay on the line. One clinician called it cosmic vertigo, which is a fancy way to say your everyday problems suddenly look like thumbtacks on a runway. A psychologist at Stanford, Dr. Susan Shun, tried to give it shape. Our brains are built for tribes and horizons, she told a local radio host. We've just extended the horizon to interplanetary distances without moving our feet. Her advice was disarmingly simple. Go outside, look up, and then do the dishes. It turns out ordinary chores have a way of stitching torn thoughts back together. Faith communities pivoted faster than most pundits predicted. The Vatican released a note that read like it had been waiting in a drawer. God's creation is vast, it said, and intelligence elsewhere would only widen awe, not narrow it. A rabbi in Chicago smiled into a camera and said, "We've always practiced listening for a still, small voice." Maybe sometimes it's at 1.42 gigahertz. An imam, asked point-blank if this complicated anything, shrugged politely. The Quran already speaks of worlds, he said. We didn't set the table for one guest. In megachurches, some pastors celebrated the encounter as proof that the divine writes big. Others worried out loud about spiritual jurisdiction. The best of them did what good pastors have always done: hugged people at the door and promised coffee in the hall. Markets did what markets do. Aerospace stocks rode a roller coaster like it was their job. Companies that make deep space antennas had a week they'll be bragging about at holiday parties for the next decade. Insurers quietly recalculated the odds of unexpected radio interference, which is the dry actuarial way to say alien static may ruin your satellite's big day. Lithium futures bobbed for reasons no one could fully agree on, but sounded plausible in earnings calls. Cryptocurrencies sprouted with names you'd blush to repeat to your accountant. A few were earnest experiments in time-stamped, species-agnostic protocols. Most were just people selling glow-in-the-dark beanies at noon. Schools felt like someone had swapped the hallway air with rocket fuel. In physics classes, students who once avoided show your work suddenly wanted to learn Fourier transforms, because that's how you peel information out of a murky signal. Community colleges added evening workshops where retirees learned to build backyard hydrogen line receivers out of salvage and stubbornness. A teacher in Ohio filmed a whiteboard lesson titled, "Why Primes Are the Friendliest Numbers," and 50,000 people watched it between soccer practice and reheating pasta. Art reacted like a tuning fork. Painters leaned into clean circles and thin lines, channeling orbits and spectrums. Composers wrote pieces that hopped in prime-length bars, 2, 3, 5, 7, until the rhythm felt like an invitation. A dance company staged a piece where the performers crossed the stage in slow arcs that never closed, a human diagram of a hyperbola, and somehow the audience understood it without the math. At a small museum, a placard asked visitors to hum gently at the same note for 30 seconds, so the room can remember what hydrogen sounds like, and nobody complained, because sometimes it's nice to be silly together. Radio culture blossomed. In borrowed church basements and stargazing fields, people tuned $40 software-defined radios to the same quiet patch of spectrum and sat in folding chairs, sipping thermoses, listening to something that sounded like nothing. It's hard to explain the appeal to anyone who hasn't tried it. You're basically listening for a dot on a graph to brighten, but in that vigil, there's the same hush as a campfire. Neighbors argued softly about whether the little wiggle on the waterfall display was a passing plane or the universe clearing its throat. A retired ham in Wales put it best: it's like fishing without the guilt. You throw your attention into the dark and let it float. Cities noticed the surge and rediscovered the old romance of dimmer lights. A handful of councils revived dusty, dark sky proposals, and a few actually passed. The first night after one city shut half its unneeded towers, people posted grainy phone photos of Orion and cried in the comments. Hardware stores ran out of red flashlights, which everyone suddenly knew preserved night vision. Somewhere, an LED factory manager told their kids at breakfast, "We get to make the stars come back a little," and that's the sort of sentence that sticks. Of course, not all reactions were generous. Message boards lit up with theories that the whole thing was a psyop to distract from taxes, weather, elections, you name it. A viral clip insisted the spectrum plots were faked because the font is wrong. Moderators tried to keep up without turning into hall monitors. The smarter platforms leaned into transparency, pinning links to raw data and simple tutorials. Here's how to see what the astronomers see. That approach, unsurprisingly, worked better than scolding. When you let people touch the instrument, they hear the note for themselves. Governments had the difficult job of seeming calm, while also actually being calm. A patchwork of agencies agreed, at least for now, to keep the content of any future transmissions public and promptly archived, like weather data. A senior official quipped off camera. We learned from meteorology if you hide the rain, people still get wet. It helped that dozens of universities and hobbyists could verify the basics from their own gear. Reality had become satisfyingly distributed. There were tiny social rituals that will make wonderful footnotes in some history book. Couples drove out to the edges of town to go hear the carrier, then proposed at the exact moment the plot line thickened, because romance is a scavenger and will use whatever it finds. Bookstores set up front tables with paperbacks about astrobiology, philosophy, and, for reasons known only to managers, sourdough. A cafe put a hand-lettered sign by the espresso machine. Ask about our 1420.4 megahertz latte, which tasted exactly like a regular latte, and that was the joke. Neighborhood kids started chalking little prime sequences on sidewalks, and somewhere a parent made the world's most earnest refrigerator art out of a spectrogram printout. Underneath the glitter, there was practical work. Emergency planners wrote memos about solar radio coexistence, and what if the next visitor glows so hard it steps on GPS? Observatory IT teams hardened their networks, not against interstellar hackers. No one knew how to think about that, yet, but against routine mischief from Earth. Campus counselors added drop-in hours for students whose existential crisis manifested, oddly, as insomnia on Tuesdays. Give your life 2 columns, one counselor advised. One for stuff you can do something about by Friday, and one for stuff you can sit with quietly under the sky. Meanwhile, the people who track space debris added a new line to their dashboards. It turns out even a shy communication with a distant object can get tangled in the spaghetti of satellites. And nobody wants to accidentally ping a weather bird when aiming at a traveler from between the stars. A flight director described the new discipline as celestial courtesy, which sounds quaint until you remember how many thousands of things are up there, all in motion, all with feelings if you anthropomorphize enough, which, to be fair, we do. Did the global mood tilt toward fear or wonder? It kept wobbling like a coin, settling for a while on curiosity. Enough people, across enough time zones, decided that the sanest response to a possible mind beyond the sky was to make our own minds a little better. Learn a concept. Share a graph. Be patient with the fact that truth takes time to gel. The best comment I saw, posted under a grainy backyard spectrum with 3 hopeful pixels circled in red, said simply, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I like doing it with you." If you're waiting for the part where presidents deliver grave speeches, you may be waiting forever. The gravity is here already, diffused into bedtime stories and office chatter, and the way crowded subways feel a hair kinder. The real statement, our real statement, looks like 1,000 small adjustments. A class added, a light dimmed, a meeting where someone says, "Let's publish that." We didn't elect a spokesperson for Earth. We behaved like one. And now, because human attention is a renewable, but not infinite resource, the tempo will slow. The object will recede, literally and figuratively. But the practice we built in the rush, that blend of skepticism and delight, has a half-life. It lingers. The next time a thin line brightens at the hydrogen whisper, more of us will know how to stand still and listen. The decision wasn't made with trumpets. It sounded more like a zipper, quiet, inevitable, pulled in one smooth motion. If something from the deep had answered our call and was still within reach, we were going to go say hello the old-fashioned way by showing up. That meant building a spacecraft on calendar time, not geologic time. Engineers call it schedule risk. Everyone else calls it, "Are you serious?" The plan that took shape over a handful of hair-on-fire meetings was charmingly unromantic. Use what exists. Shine it up. Point it well. A program manager summed it up between sips of lukewarm coffee. We're not inventing a violin. We're tuning the one we already have. The heavy-lift rockets that usually dream about Mars could throw a reasonably sized probe onto a fast track. The propulsion was the quiet, kind solar electric, which turns sunlight into electricity and uses it to push ions, tiny charged particles, out the back for a very gentle but very steady shove. If a chemical rocket is a sprinter, an ion thruster is a walker who never stops for lunch. Navigation would be the trick. Our target wasn't a sleepy asteroid lumbering around the sun. It was on a hyperbolic path, which is just math's way of saying in, wave, out, gone. Imagine trying to catch a frisbee someone threw from a moving car while you're jogging on a curving track. You can do it, but you're not allowed to blink. A flight dynamics lead explained the vibe. We need to know where it is now, but more importantly, where it will be when we get there. And then still more importantly, where it decides to be after that. The decides wasn't entirely a joke. So the eyes got sharper. Networks of radio dishes spread across continents linked their clocks so tightly that they acted like a single giant very long baseline interferometry, or VLBI, which is a mouthful meaning. Put telescopes far apart, synchronize them with absurdly precise atomic time, and you can pinpoint positions with spooky accuracy. The math is delicate. The principle is simple. 2 ears hear direction better than one. A planet-sized ear hears it best. On board, guidance had to be smart enough to improvise. You can't joystick a spacecraft across tens of millions of kilometers with a round-trip light delay long enough to brew tea. So the navigation software learned a few stage magician tricks. Spot the telltale shift in the star field. Predict the tiny nudge from sunlight. Correct your aim like a batter watching a pitcher's release rather than the ball's flight. Autonomy is a fancy word. It mostly means we trust you to handle surprises without texting home first. The instruments list looked like a party invite where you want a little of everything and exactly the right guests. Cameras, obviously, but tuned for dim objects and fast passes. Radio receivers that could listen wide, then narrow down like a photographer twisting a focus ring. A laser communicator, because if a radio hello felt good, an optical wink might feel excellent. A few microprobes tucked under the main bus like fledglings, able to peel off and skim closer if the geometry and the nerves lined up. One scientist described them with parental pride. If the big craft is the journalist, these are the stringers. They can risk what the main camera can't. Because we are who we are, someone asked about scooping a sample. The planetary protection folks, whose job is to keep Earth and other worlds from swapping microbes or metals without consent, raised both eyebrows and a small red flag. The compromise was basically common sense with nice stationery. No touching unless touching is clearly invited visible shedding, obvious debris, or some unmistakable we understand gesture in the signals. Treat it like a museum, a COSPER advisor said. Hands behind your back unless the docent says otherwise. All of this, by the way, was being assembled while the world did its normal Tuesday things. Schedules were drafted over video calls, where a cattail occasionally crossed an engineer's camera. Procurement officers discovered that certain exotic alloys had supply chains that run through exactly one factory in a town you've never heard of. A guidance coder posted a late-night message in a chat. We just passed test case 37. I'm crying, and it's probably the coffee. The romance of exploration looks suspiciously like spreadsheets until the last 5 minutes. And then it looks like transcendence again. Money found the project the way water finds a slope. National agencies ponied up because that's their job, and because their scientists had been rehearsing for this in their heads since grad school. Private companies leaned in with hardware and ground time, and, less visible but just as precious, the software talent that makes antennas sing in chorus. A few philanthropists helped grease the parts of the process that usually squeak. Testing hours, clean room shifts, the unglamorous adapters that let part A from country X bolt securely to part B from country Y. International, in practice, means learning to say thank you in more than one language and to use each other's screwdrivers without starting a standards war. The calendar, relentless as gravity, kept eating months. That focused everyone wonderfully. Camera teams accepted that perfection is a bedtime story and went for robust. Combs engineers designed their error correction like overbuilt bridges. Even if half the packets fell off the truck, the message would arrive wearing a seatbelt. A mission planner, asked what kept him up at night, laughed softly. "Sleep is for missions with margins," he said, then added, "We're fine," which is how you know he meant the opposite, and also that they were, somehow, actually fine. There were small delights. The team's signal analysts built a public web page where you could watch the tracking arcs update, delayed and sanitized, enough to keep the chaos manageable, but raw enough to be honest. It looked like a child's drawing of a comet path scribbled over a music staff, and it taught thousands of people, gently, what a Doppler curve is, how a tone rises and falls as something approaches and recedes. That's one of the lovely things about this whole business. It smuggles science into your day, like a kind friend smuggling vegetables into a teenager's pasta. And yes, there were arguments, because that's how grown-ups who care about the future behave. Do we transmit from the spacecraft during the pass, risking confusion, or keep it passive and let the ground do the talking? In the end, the answer was deliberately boring. Listen first, then speak softly, then listen again, all on pre-agreed frequencies with the mother of all paper trails. If you're going to chat with a visitor who may be older than our myths, you bring your best manners. Launch day arrived without the usual champagne-soaked cliches, mostly because nobody wanted to jinx anything. Rockets have a way of making you humble, even when you've done everything right. The ascent was uneventful in the way that makes engineers weep with gratitude. Upper stage separation looked like two fireflies parting ways. A few hours later, a small tone reached the ground a carrier, a heartbeat. A flight director whispered, "We are on our way," as if saying it too loudly might disturb the math. Cruise was where the anxious quiet lived. Solar arrays unfurled like careful origami. The ion thruster lit, and the acceleration, needle twitched in that barely there way that adds up to the impossible if you wait long enough. The spacecraft began its slow ballet of calibrations. Check the star tracker against catalogs. Nudge the attitude by a whisper. Rehearse the choreography of the approach sequence until it was muscle memory burned into code. Far behind the scenes, the comms team rehearsed too. They practiced locking onto a tone near the hydrogen line, the famous 1420.4 megahertz, the spin-flip frequency of hydrogen atoms, beloved because the universe itself marks it with a tiny tick, and then slicing the spectrum into shards, so thin you could hear a mosquito step. If a reply came in those 6 hours, they wanted to be the kind of listeners who do not interrupt. The public didn't get a minute by minute, and that was good for everyone's nerves. But they did get what mattered, the rendezvous window, the time zones translated, the rough map of the pass like a treasure route with X marking the best moments to breathe. Schools made assemblies of it. Night shift workers set alarms. In kitchens and dorms and hospital break rooms, people planned to be awake together. Was it reckless to chase a stranger across the inner system? It felt more like hospitality. We'd been allowed neighbors for a century, bouncing sitcoms and radar, pings off the cosmic walls. When a knock came steady, polite, on the most universal of doorbells, we didn't pretend we weren't home. We baked a pie with the ingredients on the shelf, wrote a note in numbers, and set out, hoping our guest would still be at the curb by the time we reached the door. The last simulations ran with a seriousness that felt like prayer. Computers don't pray, but the people who watch their progress bars sometimes do. When the final go rippled through the control rooms, it carried the weight of all the maybes and what-ifs and let's not screw this ups that had haunted the halls for months. Then there was nothing to do but fly the plan, trust the training, and let the quiet blue flame push us toward a speck in a black ocean, a speck that, against every sober expectation, had said it could hear us. The time on the wall clock was anything but cosmic, and yet it ruled the day. 6 hours. That was the whole dance. After months of engineering and weeks of quietly clenched jaws, the window opened like a theater curtain. First contact by flyby, the fast kind, the kind where you have to nail your lines on the first take because there is no second act. The geometry was tricky in the charming way astronomy loves. The sun, our craft, and the visitor formed angles that photographers would call a terrible selfie and navigators would call a phase angle. Same idea, really. Backlighting turns even ordinary objects into silhouettes. With something already faint, you work for every photon. The team had rehearsed this move for months. Cameras tuned to gobble light like insomniacs gulp coffee. Sensors biased hot so they would wake at the slightest glitter. Everything that could be focused was focused, and then refocused again as the guidance software trimmed the approach by millimeters that would matter later as kilometers. The delay between doing a thing and knowing you did a thing is called light time, and today it felt like a drumbeat. Ping the spacecraft. Wait 8 minutes and change, adjust, wait again. It's like shouting from one canyon rim to another and counting heartbeats for the echo while you keep walking. Control rooms learned to breathe in those gaps. People sipped water, stared at dot plots that were, when you squinted, just hope rendered in pixels. And then there it was. Not a saucer, not a rock, but a sliver that refused to behave like either. When sunlight struck at just the right angle, the brightness didn't smear like dust or sparkle like ice. It pinged, a tight glint that came and went with the kind of regularity that makes engineers narrow their eyes and begin sentences with, "Okay, so." The shape resolved as a long, thin pane, like several black kites stacked together and slightly canted. The first thermal snap showed warm and cool patches that didn't match any simple sunlit side versus dark side story. A materials scientist whispered into her headset, "Selective emissivity," which is a fancy way of saying some surfaces radiate heat like they mean it, and others keep it like a secret. A word about the tone everyone had been listening for. Hydrogen's spin flip line, the 1420 megahertz. Hum that atoms sing when an electron realigns with a proton sits in a quiet slice of the radio band. A natural meeting point. For weeks, receivers on Earth had been hearing a narrow tone near that frequency, drifting exactly the way it should if it were riding with a fast-moving object. Today, the craft itself listened, and the tone was there too, clean and thin, with faint sidebands like tiny shoulders on either side. Sidebands happen when you change a signal in a rhythmic way, the radio equivalent of vibrato. It's one of those tiny signs that makes you sit up straighter. The plan, written out in painfully polite language and signed by more committees than a new bridge, was simple enough to describe. Listen first. If nothing changed for a full hour, breathe out one little hello. A prime number ladder sent absurdly slow, with error correction wrapped around it like bubble wrap. No diagrams, no speeches. Just a mathematical throat clearing a civilization could recognize, even if it hated our taste in television. An ethicist on the oversight call put it well. We are not sending biography. We are sending knock-knock. 47 minutes in, the visitor's carrier did something it had never done before. It stepped. Not a chirp, not a wobble from the spacecraft's motion, but a tidy, quantized hop upward by exactly the amount you'd make if you wanted to wave without breaking eye contact. The radio lead said, very calmly, "We have a discrete offset," and then, less calmly and more human, "That's a nod." There's a lot you can do with a nod. The craft kept listening and, per the script, offered its whisper when the clock struck the hour. 2, 3, 5, 7. In school, you learn prime numbers because they're good at making math tests annoying. In space, you use them because no river makes primes, no wind makes primes, no volcano makes primes. If you hear primes, something that counts is counting at you. What followed was part music, part mirror. The carrier slid down by the same increment it had just climbed. Then the sidebands fattened, as if the tone were breathing. Wideband samplers, which normally loaf along overweight and underexcited, suddenly earned their keep. The pattern wasn't speech in any human sense. It was pulses inside pulses, headers inside headers, like envelopes you open to find more envelopes, and finally, a note. The structure shouted logic, even before the content said anything you could label. A signal analyst later described the moment with a grin that hadn't left his face in days. It felt like finding a zipper on the sky. Meanwhile, the pictures. The best frame of the pass came with the sun at a slant and the craft sliding laterally, a move you do when you want to stretch time. Imagine driving past a barn and crabbing your car sideways so the barn stays in your window longer. The shape filled maybe a third of the sensor. Any closer, and we'd be drifting into reckless. The edges were too crisp for a snowball, too planar for a rubble pile, with seams that weren't cracks so much as alignments, the way you see the edge where two panes meet in a skylight. No rivets, no writing, just geometry, so tidy it made human hardware look a little improvised. One of the microprobes think shoebox with a PhD peeled off and began its own tiny arc. Its task was simple: get a different angle on the same moment. Stereo vision, but with two cameras hundreds of meters apart. If you want to know whether a glint is a mirror or a trick, move your head. Spacecraft do it with thrusters puffing like sighs. When the two views overlapped, a software pipeline turned them into a 3D reconstruction that would keep grad students happily caffeinated for years. Back in Radioland, the pattern inside the pattern turned into something that made coders in 3 time zones slide forward in their chairs. Headers that announced length, markers that identified order, checksums that let you know you hadn't imagined any of it. Those are boring words for a lovely idea. Whoever made this expected errors, and lovingly armored the message so it could survive noise, dropouts, and our occasional incompetence. A mathematician who rarely speaks in metaphors said into the room, "They designed for us," and the room went very, very quiet. We did not get, "Hello, Earth." We got something better for a first date. Shared ground. The content looked like constants before it looked like anything else. Ratios that bind the universe the speed of light. A fine structure constant that governs how light and matter flirt rendered in units. No civilization could misunderstand, because they were built from the very frequency we were using. From the periods of pulses we could count with the hardware we had. This is how you teach without words. You point at rocks and numbers and say together, "This." And just when the radio team felt flush with their own competence, the optical deck raised a hand. The visitor's surface flashed, not randomly and not as a single glitter, but as a timed series that matched the cadence of the radio box with a fixed offset. That's called a cross-band handshake. It says, in physics, "I heard you here. I can also play there." A veteran instrument lead, the kind who's seen a dozen missions and knows better than to anthropomorphize, exhaled anyway and said, "They're polite." Polite does not mean easy. Not everything aligned with our expectations. A brief puff of material dust, gas, engineered confetti, haloed off one edge and drifted sunward, then was gone as if a vent had burped and shut. Spectrometers peered and saw a hint of carbon chains, but not the comet chemistry textbooks would bet on. The radio tone's timing jittered by hair-thin margins during the brightest flashes, as if the same system handled both show and song. A skeptic in the review loop flagged every anomaly with relish. "We will not get fooled by fireworks," she said, and nobody disagreed. The pass ended the way good theater ends, on a note you can carry home. The craft rotated to keep antennas on target as long as its momentum wheels could stand the stress. The final packet from the visitor repeated an earlier block with a tiny correction baked in, as if to say we'd misheard a digit and they were tidying it up for us. That's a small kindness. In navigation terms, it's a lighthouse not only shining, but winking 3 times to make sure you know which lighthouse it is. When the downlink finally went quiet and the craft fell back into cruise mode, there was no cheering. Not at first. People stared at hands, at logs, at the tiny smudges modern screens insist on showing you, no matter how often you wipe them. Then someone laughed, the nervous kind, and that broke the spell. A principal investigator, the sort who writes proposals careful enough to lull you, quoted an old line with new warmth. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Then she added, but my friends, today we have presence. What did we learn in 6 hours? Enough to argue about for years, enough to publish a library, enough to admit that the question we started with, did we somehow call this thing here, might be less important than the one the day had taught us to ask. Now that we can talk a little, what's the next good sentence? Here's the part where we answer the question everyone came for, and we do it without pretending the universe is a courtroom with neat rules of evidence. Did we summon 3 IATLAS? Not in the clap your hands and a spaceship appears sense. No ritual candles, no Latin incantations, unless you count Maxwell's equations. But did we flip some cosmic porch light and make ourselves impossible to ignore? That, I think, is exactly what happened. Picture the last century as a slow crescendo. First, the leaky stuff and baseball games bleeding into the night. Sitcoms tumbling out of rooftop antennas. The accidental glow of a planet learning to speak out loud. Then the deliberate shouts. Radar pings that could light up Venus. A 3-minute postcard from a giant dish that yelled mathematics at a star cluster because we couldn't help ourselves. We didn't cast a spell. We crossed a threshold. The bubble of our chatter swelled and touched new neighborhoods. And in one of those neighborhoods, someone with taste for prime numbers and tidy engineering blinked and said, "Ah, there. That's the spine of the story." And the flyby didn't so much answer it as underline every interesting word. The narrow carrier tone near hydrogen's famous frequency wasn't just a happy accident of plasma. It behaved like intent behaves, with those clean little frequency steps and the sidebands fattening when the conversation got lively. The optics chimed in with those synchronized flashes, radio and light keeping time like musicians who've rehearsed together for years. And the payload of the message constants first, then structure, then something practical felt less like a boast and more like a neighbor leaning over the fence to say, if you want to join the block party, here's how we wire the lights. Now, the careful voices will remind us that correlation is not causation. They are right. They are paid, in spirit if not in cash, to be right about that. Just because our noisiest decades line up suspiciously well with launch windows you can back calculate doesn't prove anyone was listening in real time. The galaxy is big enough to deliver coincidences that look like plots. But when coincidences start behaving like a curriculum, when the timing echoes our milestones and the content meets us precisely where our capabilities are, well, a human brain would call that a pattern. A professional will call it a pattern, and then spend 6 months making sure it isn't a trick of the light. Both instincts are healthy. Together, they keep us from crowning ourselves the center of the cosmos, while still allowing the obvious to knock politely and come in. So, did we pull the trigger? A radio astronomer on the team, the sort with a dusting of chalk on every sweater, put it more elegantly. We didn't summon anything. We became addressable. That's a deceptively important word. Addressable means your signal stands out from the noise enough for return mail to find you. It's the difference between tossing a bottle into the surf and filing a change of address form at the post office. And the technical manual were decoding those layered packets with error correction, wrapped like armor reads exactly, like instructions for joining an existing postal system rather than inventing one from scratch. You can almost hear the exasperation of an ancient network that's been doing this for ages. Please use the format, Earth. There's a human itch to make this grander than it has to be. We want our century of chatter to have been a summons worthy of epic fantasy. It's certainly more romantic to imagine 3i Atlas slinging itself across interstellar voids because somebody in 1974 pressed a ceremonial button under a giant Caribbean sky. Reality is both humbler and, to my taste, better. A civilization that knows how to listen well enough can sweep volumes of sky and tag the moment the world clears the line from interesting chemistry experiment to company worth having. That's us. Not magic, not destiny, just louder than background. The reply followed not because we were chosen, but because we finally showed up in the directory. And yet there's a small flourish we shouldn't downplay. The exchange during the flyby included a correction, a tiny edited repeat that fixed a digit we'd mangled. That's not the behavior of an automated lighthouse, mindlessly casting beams. That's pedagogy. It's the smallest possible proof of kindness, like a teacher tapping the pencil where you made the slip and letting you fix it yourself. They're polite, the optics lead said, and for once, nobody argued the metaphor away. Polite doesn't mean safe, of course. The manual is a how-to for a transmitter that would make our current gear feel like a crystal radio kit. If we build it and light it, we stop being the anonymous blue dot with pleasant wildlife and start being a node in a network. That's a promotion with all the responsibilities promotions bring. You will hear earnest debates about whether we should wait, whether we should listen for a decade or a century before speaking in a voice the galaxy can't miss. You should listen to those debates. We've been alone for a very long time. We can take another beat to breathe, but there's a different kind of caution that can hide inside endless waiting. Sometimes you must act to learn. As one of the ethicists on the Oversight Council said, a sentence that sounds like a bumper sticker until you realize a species can spend millennia avoiding its next sentence. Because silence is comfortable and noisy certainty is not. We won't get certainty until we use the system they're offering. The first transmission doesn't have to be a biography. It can be the same thing we did today, just cleaner and brighter and on time with the beat they taught us. Mathematics first, then a mutual map of the playground, and a small, careful question. I know the anxiety that shivers alongside the wonder. People always ask about the bad scenarios. What if the network isn't a salon, but a trap? What if a loud node is a tasty snack? Those are not stupid questions. But the evidence so far points to a culture of excruciating accommodation. The frequency choice, the redundancy, the way the message uses physical constants as scaffolding instead of assuming. We share a dictionary. Those are the fingerprints of a system designed to include strangers with wildly different sensory suites, lifespans, and biographies. Predators do not usually send you instructions for building armor before they visit. The more interesting fear, to me, is smaller and sneakier. What if we join and discover we are not special? What if the galaxy is full of minds and we're just one more coffee shop on a long, bright street? If that turns out to be the case, it will sting for a day and then feel like freedom. Specialness is heavy. Belonging is lighter. And the work of being a good neighbor, keeping your power clean, labeling your packets politely, not shouting over the quiet zones, will feel familiar in all the right ways, because we already practice versions of it at home when we remember to be our best selves. So yes, in the ordinary practical sense, we caused this, not because we were clever enough to compose the perfect opener, but because we were noisy enough to be noticed and steady enough to stay noticed. The rest, the choice in front of us now, is less a mystery than a mirror. We can keep rehearsing alone, forever practicing in an empty theater. Or we can step through the stage door, find our mark, and deliver a first line that someone else has been patiently waiting to hear. It won't be, "Take me to your leader." It won't be poetry. It will be a rhythm and a ratio, and an agreement on what a second is. And it will be the most beautiful small talk in the history of anything that has ever bothered to count. When we started, the question sounded almost mischievous. Could humanity have somehow triggered the arrival of 3IATLAS. As if we'd tapped the aquarium glass, and a curious shape drifted over to see what made the ripple. After the data, after the nods and the glints and the neat little correction like a teacher's pencil, the answer is almost disappointingly straightforward. We didn't trigger a visitor. We qualified for a reply. The cosmos did not change the day. The tone stepped and the flash answered. We did. We became answerable. Now comes the sentence after the ping. We know the tempo. We know the place to meet. We even have the IKEA-style diagram for the lamppost we're supposed to build at the end of our cul-de-sac. The question is no longer, did we summon? But what do we say next? And that, fortunately, is a very human kind of problem to have. If you're still awake, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you if this turned into the best bedtime story you've had since the one with the goodnight moon. Let me leave you with something simple. The universe didn't change its rules for us. No cosmic hand reached down to tip the scales. We did the ordinary, stubborn human thing. We kept talking. Radios coughed, dishes hummed. A million tiny transmitters painted the night with our messy biography. Over decades, that background murmur turned into a signature, and a signature, once clear enough, earns you something precious in any crowded room. A reply. That's the real magic in all of this, and it's the kind of magic you can diagram. A frequency that sits beside hydrogen's famous whisper. A pattern of primes that any mind with fingers or tentacles or charge carriers can count. A tiny optical wink that matches a radio beat like a drummer nodding to the bassist. Nothing supernatural. Everything deliberate. Intelligence likes to be legible. An old communications engineer told me once. The first kindness is to be easy to read. If you look back at the whole arc, from our accidental chatter to a traveler that behaved like a patient tutor, you can feel that kindness baked into the choreography. Of course, the word kindness is doing a lot of work there. We don't know if the network they sketched for us is a garden party or a zoning board. We don't know if the etiquette is strict and the neighbors fussy, or if the whole thing is more like ham radio with better math. What we do know is what the message chose to be, a set of blueprints and guardrails, not a sermon. Constants first, then construction, then an invitation that sounds suspiciously like a deadline. It's not a riddle. It's a calendar appointment. Show up at this time, speaking this way, with this microphone, and you will be heard not as a novelty, but as a participant. If you're wondering whether that's dangerous, join the club. We're built to see cliffs where the ground changes color. But there's another way to look at it. The instructions were tailored to our present, not to some fantasy version of Earth that already solved fusion, hunger, and screen time. The power budgets are hard, but not ridiculous. The components ask for precision rather than miracles. And the operating rules put biological worlds first, insisting that the loud parts live off-planet, far from migrating birds and whales who read the magnetic field like a map. If there's a trap in there, it's elaborate enough to qualify as hospitality until proven otherwise. Maybe you felt that creeping smallness since the first tone stepped and the first flash answered. I have. It's the vertigo you get when you realize your hometown is a dot on a dot on a dot. But small is not the same as unimportant. In a galaxy where time is measured in the patience of stars, showing up with a clean signal and a steady hand isn't trivial. It's manners. And manners are civilization in miniature. The beacon, if we build it, isn't a billboard. It's a promise that we can share a channel without drowning the room. There's a joke among radio folks that half the job is learning to shut up at the right times. That's going to be our test. Not whether we can blast a greeting bright enough to rattle the ionosphere, but whether we can join a conversation that's been running for a very long while and avoid the temptation to monologue. The protocol they modeled pushes us in that direction. Slow, redundant, polite, with more error correction than bravado. It reads like etiquette written in physics, and I find that oddly comforting. Even if the neighbors are strange, the table manners are familiar. So where does that leave the mischievous question we started with? Did we call 3 IATLAS? Or did it call us? My favorite answer is still the least romantic and the most empowering. We became addressable. When you print your number in the directory, you don't control who rings, but you do control how you answer. We've had our first ring. We picked up, said something intelligible, and heard an unmistakable voice on the other end do the intellectual equivalent of smiling. The rest is a series of choices about what kind of species we want to be when someone is listening on purpose. Between now and the day the big transmitter hums to life, there's plenty of practical work that doesn't require a cape. Engineers will argue over oscillator drift the way chefs argue over salt. Ecologists will flag nesting seasons and migration paths, so our infrastructure keeps a light footprint where it matters. Lawyers will invent phrases none of us asked for, and some of us will be grateful for later. Teachers will slide fresh pages into the curriculum, and somewhere a kid who liked space only in the way they liked dinosaurs will catch the bug for real, because prime numbers suddenly feel like a language rather than a punishment. It won't all be grand, but it will all be part of growing into our louder voice. And yes, there will be doubters, and they're not your enemy. Good doubt doesn't smother wonder. It keeps it from slipping on loose gravel. The skeptical papers, the replication runs, the grumpy peer reviews that ask, "Are you sure?" For the 7th time, those are how we deserve the future we're building. The thing worth noticing is that even the careful voices have shifted from absolutely not to show me more. That's progress disguised as caution tape. Here's the part where I'm supposed to pitch you the tidy moral. I don't have one. I have a feeling, and it's this. For the first time, our species might stop telling itself stories about being alone and start practicing the habits of not alone. That's not only an astronomical adjustment. It's a psychological one. What we owe to each other here, patience, clarity, gentleness, humility, maps neatly on to what the manual asks of us out there. It would be very us to meet the galaxy with better manners than we show in traffic. It would also be very us to rise to the occasion. If you made it to this last paragraph, you already know the final ask. Keep listening. Keep asking for evidence, and then delight in it when it appears. Keep the wonder and the wit in the same pocket, because you'll need both. And when the day comes to send the first sentence in a voice no one can miss, send something that sounds like us at our best. Careful, curious, ready to learn, and not above a good joke if the timing is right. If you enjoyed this little nighttime expedition through a very large idea, you know what to do. Subscribe so the next chapter finds you without needing a radio dish, and share it with the friend who still insists the wow. Signal is a prank by a bored grad student. I'd love to hear your specific take in the comments. If you had to choose the very first meaningful line Earth should transmit when our big mic goes live nothing flowery, just one clean sentence, what would you send? And while you're there, point us toward the next mission. Should we follow the thread into the quiet water hole between hydrogen and hydroxyl? Chase the rumor of megastructures by learning to read starlight for scaffolding? Or look closer to home at the way our own planet would look as an exoplanet if someone out there was trying to decide whether to call? Either way, I'll be here, lights dimmed, kettle on, waiting to talk about the next improbable thing that turns out to be perfectly reasonable. Once you give it a proper listen, good night and good signal.